At 7:42 a.m. on December 26, 1943, Sergeant Bull Kowalski was not fighting the Japanese Empire. He was fighting the ocean, and the ocean was winning. He was standing chest-deep in the boiling surf of Cape Gloucester, watching his landing craft disintegrate against a hidden reef. The boat had hit the coral with the violence of a car slamming into a brick wall, tearing the steel bottom open like a tin can. The ramp was jammed halfway down, the engine was screaming in a high-pitched whine of dying machinery, and the Pacific Ocean was rushing in to claim everything inside. For the squad of Marines scrambling over the gunwales, it wasn't just a shipwreck. It was a tactical disaster. In the chaos of the impact, the crates containing their heavy equipment had slid off the slick metal deck and vanished into the dark water. The mortar tubes were gone. The heavy tripod for the machine gun was gone. The extra boxes of grenades were sitting on the bottom of the bay, drifting in the current. The men hit the black volcanic sand of the beach, coughing up salt water, alive but effectively naked. They had their rifles, the ammunition in their belts, and the wet clothes on their backs. Against a dug-in enemy waiting in the tree line, they were terrifyingly undergunned. Kowalski dragged himself up the beach, his boots filled with water, and looked at his squad. They were young kids, mostly replacements who had never heard a shot fired in anger. They were shivering, not just from the cold rain that was sweeping across the island, but from the sudden realization of their vulnerability. A Marine squad without its heavy weapons is just a group of men with targets painted on their chests. They were supposed to be the anvil that the rest of the platoon hammered the enemy against, but now they were just infantry with nothing to back them up. The lieutenant, a fresh officer who looked like he had shaved for the first time that morning, was already shouting orders to move inland, to get off the exposed beach before the Japanese mortars started falling. But Kowalski didn't move inland. He stopped and looked back at the dying boat. It was listing heavily to the left, the waves breaking over the stern. Most men saw a wreck. Kowalski saw a hardware store. His eyes locked onto the rear of the craft, right above the engine compartment. Bolted to a heavy steel ring mount was the boat's anti-aircraft defense. It was a twin .30 caliber mount, two Browning machine guns paired together side by side, fed by massive ammunition boxes that were welded to the frame. It was a weapon designed to shoot down Zero fighters and dive bombers, a piece of industrial-grade violence that could pour out lead like a fire hose. The lieutenant saw Kowalski staring at the boat and screamed at him to get moving. He told the sergeant that the equipment was a loss, that they had to regroup at the rally point. He told him that they would find weapons later. It was the sensible, by-the-book order. You don't salvage heavy gear from a sinking boat under fire. You cut your losses and save your skin. But Kowalski had been in the Pacific long enough to know that later usually meant never. He knew that up in the jungle, a rifle wasn't enough to stop a Banzai charge. He knew that if they went up that hill without a heavy weapon, they were walking into a meat grinder. Kowalski waded back into the surf. The water was rising fast, slapping against his chest. He yelled at two of his biggest riflemen to follow him. They looked at him like he had lost his mind, but they followed. When they reached the listing boat, Kowalski didn't go for the rations or the radio. He climbed up the slippery steel hull and grabbed the twin mount. It was a beast of a weapon. The guns, the mount, and the armor plate weighed over 200 pounds. It was bolted to the frame with 3-inch industrial bolts that were rusted shut by the salt spray. It was never meant to leave the ship. It was a permanent fixture, as much a part of the boat as the rudder. The sergeant didn't care about the design specs. He pulled a heavy wrench from the boat's emergency toolkit and went to work on the bolts. The waves were smashing the hull against the reef, throwing the men around like dolls in a washing machine. Every time the boat lurched, the heavy steel mount swung wildly, threatening to crush their hands. The riflemen were screaming that the boat was going under, that they had to leave. Kowalski ignored them. He was possessed. He cranked on the wrench until the veins in his neck bulged, fighting the rust and the torque. One by one, the bolts sheared off with a sickening snap of overstressed metal. When the last bolt gave way, the mount broke free. The weight of it nearly threw them into the water. It was an awkward, jagged lump of steel that was impossible to hold comfortably. It had no handles, no carrying case, and no tripod. It was dead weight. They wrestled it over the side of the boat, dropping it into the shallow water, and then dragged it through the surf like a dead shark. When they finally hauled it onto the sand, they collapsed, gasping for air. The lieutenant walked over, looked at the rusting pile of metal, and shook his head. He asked Kowalski what he planned to do with a naval gun that had no mount, no sights, and weighed as much as a refrigerator. The officer's mockery was the first sting of the day. He pointed out the obvious flaws. He told Kowalski that he was wasting the squad's energy. He told him that they were infantry, not a salvage crew. The other squads moving past them on the beach laughed. They saw 3 men soaking wet, covered in grease, guarding a piece of junk that belonged in a scrapyard. They made cracks about Kowalski planning to start his own navy. They asked if he was going to mount it on his back. To them, the Twin 30 was just a burden, a heavy, useless object that would slow them down in the race for the ridge. Kowalski didn't answer them. He stripped the wet shirts off the boat's dead crewmen and used them to wipe the salt water off the receivers. He checked the action on both guns. They were smooth. The barrels were cold and heavy. He looked at the massive ammunition boxes they had dragged ashore with the gun. Standard infantry belts held 50 or 100 rounds. These naval boxes held 250 rounds each. It was enough ammo to fight a small war. The lieutenant ordered them to leave it and move out. Kowalski stood up, wiped the grease on his pants, and hoisted the front of the mount. He told the two riflemen to grab the back. He told the lieutenant that he wasn't leaving the only thing on the beach that could talk louder than the Japanese. The climb to the ridge began, and with it, the real punishment. Cape Gloucester wasn't just an island. It was a biological weapon designed to kill human beings. The Marines called it the Green Inferno for a reason. The rain never stopped. It wasn't a drizzle. It was a solid sheet of water that turned the ground into a soup of mud and rotting vegetation. The mud here was deep, a thick suction cup clay that grabbed onto boots and refused to let go. Walking up the slope with just a rifle was exhausting. Dragging the iron pig, as the squad had christened the gun, was torture. They didn't have a carriage or wheels. They had to carry it by hand, gripping the jagged metal edges that cut into their palms. Every step was a battle against gravity and friction. They would take 5 steps, slip in the mud, and slide back 3. The gun would dig into the soft earth, anchoring itself like a plow. They had to curse and kick and heave to get it moving again. The sweat poured off them, mixing with the rain and the mud until they were coated in a gray slime. Their shoulders burned, their backs spasmed, and their lungs felt like they were breathing liquid fire. As they struggled up the trail, other units passed them. These men were moving fast, carrying light carbines and submachine guns. They looked at Kowalski's team with a mix of pity and amusement. They saw a sergeant who was too stubborn to admit he had made a mistake. They saw a squad breaking their backs for a weapon they couldn't even fire. The mockery followed them up the hill. "Hey Sarge, you going to anchor the island down?" one Marine shouted. "You catch any fish with that thing?" asked another. They were the jokes of men who didn't understand the math of the jungle. They thought speed was safety. They thought that being light meant being alive. Kowalski kept his head down and kept pulling. He knew something the critics didn't. He knew that when the sun went down and the Japanese came out of their holes, speed wouldn't matter. The Japanese didn't fight with speed, they fought with mass. They fought with waves of bodies that absorbed rifle fire and kept coming. A light carbine overheats after 3 magazines. A bar runs dry in 2 seconds. Against a human wave, you don't need a scalpel, you need a sledgehammer. And the Iron Pig was the biggest sledgehammer on the island. By the time they reached the defensive line at the base of Target Hill, the squad was wrecked. They were bruised, bleeding, and exhausted. They collapsed in the mud, their chests heaving, staring at the gun with hatred. It sat there in the dirt, ugly and awkward. It looked completely out of place, a piece of a boat stranded in the middle of a rainforest. The lieutenant assigned them a sector on the extreme left flank, a patch of dense kunite grass that looked directly into the dark, tangled throat of the jungle. It was a bad position. It was the kind of spot where infiltrators would probe first. The lieutenant gave Kowalski a look that said, "I told you so." He pointed out that they couldn't mount the gun on the soft ground. The recoil of 2 machine guns firing at once would flip it over. It would dig itself into the mud and be useless. He suggested they strip the guns off the mount and try to use them individually as rifles. It was a logical suggestion. It was also wrong. The power of the twin mount wasn't just in the bullets. It was in the stability of the system. It was the ability to fire 2 streams of lead at the exact same point without the barrel wandering. Kowalski ignored the officer again. He didn't dig a standard foxhole. He grabbed an entrenching tool and began to carve a shelf into the side of the ridge. He ordered his men to cut down palm logs and drag them over. They looked at him with weary eyes, but the look on his face told them that argument was not an option. They built a crib, a heavy wooden box filled with sandbags and rocks, sunk deep into the clay. It wasn't a tripod. It was a foundation. Kowalski lifted the Iron Pig and slammed it down onto the wooden frame. He used baling wire and telephone cable to lash the heavy steel base to the logs. He tightened it until the wire sang like a guitar string. He was recreating the boat. He was building a deck in the middle of the mud. When he was finished, the gun sat solid and level, the twin barrels pointing out into the green void. It looked ridiculous. It looked like a child's fort made of sticks and garbage. But when Kowalski racked the charging handles, the metallic clack-clack sound was heavy and reassuring. He opened the lids of the massive naval ammo boxes and fed the belts into the receivers. The brass cartridges were clean and dry, protected by the sealed containers. The sun began to drop behind the ridge, and the light faded into a bruised purple-gray. The rain picked up intensity, hammering against the leaves with a deafening white noise. The jungle, which had been buzzing with insects and birds all day, suddenly went quiet. It was the silence every marine dreads. It meant the predator was awake. The men in the foxholes next to Kowalski checked their rifles and looked nervously at the dark wall of trees. They were holding .30 caliber carbines and bolt-action Springfields. They looked at the twin mount, then at Kowalski, and for the first time, nobody was laughing. They were just waiting to see if the sergeant's folly was going to save them, or if they were all going to die guarding a piece of shipyard junk. The darkness that fell over Target Hill was not simply an absence of light. It was a physical weight that pressed down on the lungs of every Marine in the foxholes. The rain had intensified, transforming from a tropical downpour into a blinding, suffocating curtain of water that erased the world beyond the end of a rifle barrel. In this sensory deprivation tank, the mind began to betray the men. A shifting shadow became a charging soldier. The snap of a twig sounded like a bolt racking back. The men of the squad, soaked to the bone and shivering in the mud, gripped their weapons with white-knuckled desperation. They were exhausted, hungry, and terrified, but mostly they were waiting. And the waiting was always the weapon that did the most damage before the first shot was fired. Kowalski sat behind the iron pig, his body acting as a shield for the breech mechanisms. He had done everything he could to prepare the weapon for the environment. He had used the last of his dry socks to wrap the receiver assembly, trying to keep the relentless grit of the volcanic mud out of the moving parts. He had taken a poncho and rigged a small, flimsy tent over the ammo boxes, knowing that if the cloth belts got wet, they could swell and jam the feed trays. He was babying the machine, treating the cold steel with a tenderness that he didn't even show his own men. He knew that in a few hours, this ugly, rusted lump of naval salvage would be the only thing keeping the jungle from swallowing them whole. The men in the nearby holes were still skeptical. They looked at the contraption, the logs, the wire, the sandbags, and they saw a desperate attempt to force a square peg into a round hole. The lieutenant checked the line, moving from hole to hole, whispering orders to conserve ammunition and hold fire until they saw targets. When he reached Kowalski's position, he didn't say anything. He just shined his red lens flashlight on the twin mount for a second, illuminating the massive water-cooling jackets and the belt feed, and then moved on. The silence was an indictment. It was clear that the officer considered this position a write-off, a gap in the line plugged by a stubborn sergeant and a piece of boat anchor. But the experts who mocked the weapon were missing the crucial detail that Kowalski understood. They were thinking about infantry combat, where you shoot, move, and communicate. They were thinking about precision, but the twin mount wasn't designed for precision, it was designed for saturation. It was built to fill a cubic acre of sky with enough lead to shred an airplane made of aluminum and glass. It didn't fire in bursts, it fired in a stream, and crucially, it was designed to run hot. Infantry machine guns, like the air-cooled light .30 calibers the rest of the platoon carried, had thin barrels. If you fired them for more than a minute, the barrels would glow white and warp, destroying the gun. The twin mount had heavy, thick-walled barrels designed to dump heat. It was an industrial tool for an industrial job. The enemy they were facing wasn't interested in a fair fight. The Japanese troops on Cape Gloucester were veterans. They knew the terrain better than the Marines knew their own backyards. They didn't charge blindly into machine guns if they could avoid it. Their tactic was the creep. They would crawl on their bellies through the mud, moving inches at a time, sliding under the barbed wire like snakes. They would get close enough to smell the American cigarettes, close enough to toss a grenade into a foxhole before anyone knew they were there. It was a psychological terror tactic designed to make the Marines afraid of the dark, to make them fire wildly at phantoms and give away their positions. At 9 o'clock, the first probe hit the line. It wasn't a wave, it was a whisper. To the left of Kowalski's position, a trip flare popped, sizzling and sputtering in the rain, casting a weird, dancing green light over the ridge. In that brief flash of illumination, the Marines saw them. 3 Japanese soldiers were already inside the wire, not 20 feet away. They were covered in mud, their uniforms blending perfectly with the sludge. They weren't running. They were sprinting in a low crouch, bayonets fixed, heading straight for the machine gun nest on the flank. The Marine in the foxhole closest to the wire squeezed the trigger of his Browning automatic rifle. The weapon fired one round, crack, and then stopped. The mud had gotten into the open bolt. The gas piston was fouled. The gun was dead. The Marine frantically racked the slide, trying to clear the jam, but the wet sand had turned the precision machine steel into a paperweight. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked through the line. The Japanese soldiers saw the jam. They accelerated, screaming now, sensing the weakness. This was the nightmare scenario, the gear failing at the moment of contact. The reliable infantry weapons were choking on the filth of the island. Kowalski didn't panic. He didn't fumble with a bolt or check a safety. He simply leaned his weight into the spade grips of the twin mount. The weapon didn't have a trigger like a rifle. It had a butterfly paddle that you pushed with your thumbs. It was a mechanism that required intent. Kowalski slammed his thumbs forward. The sound that erupted from the sandbag crib was not the familiar staccato rhythm of a battlefield. It was a continuous, tearing roar, like a piece of heavy canvas being ripped by a giant hand. The two guns, firing slightly out of sync, created a harmonic vibration that drilled into the teeth of every man on the ridge. The muzzle flash was blinding, a dual tongue of flame that lit up the immediate area like a strobe light. Kowalski didn't aim at the soldiers. He couldn't track individual men moving that fast in the dark. Instead, he utilized the hose theory. He swept the guns laterally, dragging the stream of tracers across the path of the attackers. The physics of the twin mount were devastating. A single .30 caliber bullet hits with the force of a sledgehammer. Two of them, arriving milliseconds apart, act like a buzzsaw. The first Japanese soldier was hit mid-stride. He didn't fall. He was physically thrown backward, his momentum arrested instantly by the kinetic energy of the impact. The double stream of lead cut through him and chewed up the ground behind him. The other two infiltrators dove for cover, hitting the dirt behind a fallen log. Against a normal rifleman, they would have been safe. They could have popped up and thrown their grenades, but the twin mount didn't care about cover. The heavy naval ammo boxes allowed Kowalski to sustain the fire without pausing. He didn't let up. He walked the fire onto the log. The sheer volume of rounds chewed through the rotting wood in seconds, turning the cover into a cloud of splinters and sawdust. The rounds punched through the log and into the earth behind it. The screaming stopped. Kowalski released the butterfly triggers. The sudden silence was deafening. Smoke drifted from the twin barrels, mixing with the rain. The entire engagement had lasted less than 8 seconds. In that time, the Iron Pig had spit out more than 200 rounds, a volume of fire that a rifle squad couldn't produce in a minute. The Marine with the jammed bar looked over at Kowalski's position, his eyes wide, his face pale. He looked at the smoking boat gun, then down at his own useless weapon. The mockery was gone. The jokes about the scrap metal had died the second those triggers were pressed. But Kowalski knew this was just the opening move. The probe was a test. The Japanese commander out in the darkness had sacrificed those 3 men to find the heavy weapons. He wanted the Marines to reveal their positions, and Kowalski had just lit up a neon sign pointing directly at his sandbag crib. The element of surprise was gone. The enemy now knew exactly where the anchor of the defense was located. They knew there was something on that ridge that fired faster and harder than a standard machine gun. The lieutenant crawled over to Kowalski's hole, moving low through the mud. He didn't yell this time. He looked at the shredded log and the bodies in the wire. "That thing draws a lot of water, Sergeant," he said, his voice tight. It was a naval term, an admission of respect, but then he pointed out the reality. "They know you're here now. Every mortar and grenade launcher they have is going to be dialed in on this position in 5 minutes." Kowalski nodded. He knew the score. He had traded anonymity for violence. "Let him come, Lieutenant," he said, wiping the rain from his eyes. "I got plenty of belts." He wasn't being arrogant, he was being practical. He knew that moving the 200-pound gun was impossible now. They were committed. They were bolted to the ridge just like the gun had been bolted to the boat. The rain picked up again, drumming against the helmets. The minutes stretched out. 10 minutes, 20. The adrenaline from the brief firefight began to curdle into dread. The men could hear movement down in the ravine now, not the stealthy creep of infiltrators, but the heavy, shuffling sound of hundreds of men moving into position. It sounded like a river rising. The Japanese were massing. They weren't going to try to sneak through the wire next time. They were going to try to trample it. Kowalski opened the tops of the spare ammo crates. He linked the end of the belt in the gun to the start of a fresh belt, creating a continuous chain of brass that snaked down into the mud. He checked the cooling jackets on the barrels. They were warm to the touch, but the rain was doing a good job of keeping them manageable. He checked the traverse mechanism, greasing the swivel with a glob of motor oil he had scavenged. The gun had to swing freely. If it bound up even for a second, they were dead. Then the sound came. It wasn't a flare or a shot. It was a whistle, a long, mournful note that cut through the sound of the rain. It was followed by a voice, screaming in Japanese, amplified by a megaphone. It was a chant, rhythmic and terrifying. And then the jungle floor seemed to detach itself and stand up. A wall of green tracers erupted from the tree line, focusing on the ridge. The air snapped with the sound of bullets passing inches overhead. Mortar rounds began to walk up the slope, explosions throwing geysers of mud and shale into the air. Thump, crash, thump, crash. The explosions were getting closer, bracketing the position. The lieutenant was screaming orders, but nobody could hear him over the roar. Kowalski didn't fire yet. He waited. He watched the dark shapes emerging from the trees at the bottom of the hill. There were dozens of them. No, hundreds. A solid wave of brown uniforms moving up the slope, bayonets gleaming in the mortar flashes. They were screaming Banzai, a collective roar that drowned out the thunder. This wasn't a probe. This was the hammer. They were coming for the gun. They were coming to kill the man who had dared to bring a ship's weapon to a knife fight. Kowalski gripped the spade handles. He felt the vibration of the explosions through the frame of the gun. He looked at the wave of humanity surging toward him, ignoring the tracers, ignoring the mud. He took a breath, held it, and waited for them to hit the kill zone. The iron pig was hungry, and it was time to feed it. The distance between the Japanese charge and the Marine line was 100 yards of slick, volcanic mud. In daylight, a runner could cross it in 12 seconds. In the dark, under the weight of combat gear and adrenaline, it was a chaotic sprint through a minefield of tripping vines and shell craters. The Japanese assault force, screaming their war cry, covered the first 30 yards before the American line even reacted. They were moving with a terrifying, fluid momentum, a human tide designed to crash over the foxholes and drown the defenders in hand-to-hand combat. They expected the usual rhythm of resistance. They expected the sharp cracks of rifles and the short, stuttering bursts of light machine guns that would pause every few seconds to reload. They were prepared to absorb those casualties, to step over the fallen and keep running during the silence of the reloads. But when Sergeant Kowalski slammed the butterfly triggers of the twin mount forward, the rhythm of the battle didn't just change. It vanished, the weapon didn't stutter. It roared. The two barrels, synchronized by the mechanics of the heavy mount, unleashed a continuous stream of copper-jacketed lead that defied the logic of infantry combat. A standard infantry machine gun fires 500 rounds a minute, but in practice, it's much less because the gunner has to fire in short bursts to keep the barrel from melting. The twin mount was a naval weapon. It was built to fire long, sustained bursts at airplanes moving 300 miles an hour. It was built to run hot. The effect on the charging wave was catastrophic. The first rank of the Japanese assault simply evaporated. They didn't fall individually. They were swept away as if they had run into an invisible, waist-high steel cable. The kinetic energy of 1,200 rounds per minute physically pushed the charge backward. Men were lifted off their feet and thrown into the men behind them. The momentum of the attack, which had been building for 20 minutes in the ravine, slammed into a wall of physics that it couldn't break. The scream of Banzai was instantly drowned out by the mechanical scream of the guns. Kowalski wasn't aiming. In the pitch black of the storm, aiming was impossible. He was painting. He gripped the heavy spade handles and used his entire upper body to swing the mount left and right, traversing a 45-degree arc in front of his position. He was using the tracers as a paintbrush, covering the jungle floor in a crisscrossing lattice of green fire. He watched the stream of light dip and rise, adjusting his elevation by instinct. He kept the fire low, barely 2 feet off the ground. He was utilizing graze fire, skipping the rounds off the hard mud and rocks. A bullet that hits a man kills one man. A bullet that ricochets off the ground tumbles and fragments, becoming a jagged piece of shrapnel that tears through everything in its path. The Japanese soldiers in the second and third waves didn't know what was happening. They couldn't see the gun. They could only see the blinding strobe light of the muzzle flash. They tried to dive for cover, but the cover was disintegrating. The heavy .30 caliber rounds were punching through the palm trees, shredding the undergrowth, and turning the jungle itself into a weapon. Wood splinters the size of steak knives were exploding outward from the trees, acting like secondary grenades. The air in the kill zone was a mixture of lead, water, and pulverized wood. It was a grinder. Back in the foxhole, the reality of the iron pig was becoming clear to the rest of the squad. The noise was unbearable. The concussion from the twin muzzles was pounding against their chests like a physical hammer. But the most shocking thing was the duration. A normal machine gunner fires for 3 seconds, then stops. Kowalski held the triggers down for 10 seconds, then 20, then 30. The belt feed from the massive naval ammo boxes kept running. The brass casings were pouring out of the bottom of the mount in a steady metallic waterfall, piling up around Kowalski's boots, steaming in the rain. The lieutenant, who had mocked the weapon hours earlier, was now scrambling through the mud, dragging crates of ammunition toward the gun. He realized that the entire defense of the ridge now hung on this one piece of salvaged junk. The riflemen on the line had stopped firing. They couldn't see targets, and they knew that sticking their heads up during this storm of fire was suicide. They stayed low, watching the show, witnessing the difference between a weapon designed to suppress an enemy and a weapon designed to delete them. But the machine was fighting its own battle. The heat was building. Inside the heavy water jackets surrounding the barrels, the water was beginning to boil. The system was designed to circulate water to keep the steel cool, but Kowalski was pushing it beyond its naval specifications. He was firing a continuous stream without a pump to cycle the fluid. Steam began to hiss from the relief valves, a high-pitched shriek that cut through the roar of the gunfire. A cloud of white vapor erupted around the gun, wrapping Kowalski in a fog bank. This steam was dangerous. It blinded the gunner, and worse, it gave the enemy a perfect aiming point. The Japanese mortar teams in the tree line saw the white plume rising from the ridge. They adjusted their tubes. Seconds later, the ground around Kowalski's position erupted. Mud and rock showered the gun crew. Shrapnel pinged off the heavy steel shield of the mount. A piece of hot metal sliced across Kowalski's cheek, mixing blood with the oil and sweat on his face. He didn't flinch. He didn't let go of the triggers. He knew that if he stopped firing to wipe his face, the wall would fall, and the Japanese would be in the hole with knives. He shouted at the riflemen nearest to him. He needed water. The jackets were boiling dry. If the water evaporated completely, the barrels would warp, the rifling would strip out, and the gun would jam. The men scrambled, grabbing their canteens. They crawled up to the steaming gun, unscrewing the caps and pouring their precious drinking water into the filler ports on the top of the jackets. The water hit the superheated metal and sizzled, flashing instantly into more steam, but it bought the gun another minute of life. It was a desperate, chaotic pit stop in the middle of a slaughter. The Japanese commander, realizing a frontal assault was impossible against the breath of the dragon, changed tactics. He signaled his grenadiers. A suicide squad of 10 men, strapped with explosives, broke from the main group. They didn't run upright, they crawled on their stomachs, using the pile of their own dead as cover. They were trying to get under the guns, to reach the dead space immediately in front of the sandbags, where the barrels couldn't depress low enough to hit them. It was a smart move. Every machine gun has a blind spot right in front of the muzzle. Kowalski saw the movement in the shadows. He saw the dark shapes slithering over the bodies, closing the distance. 30 yards, 20 yards. He tried to lower the barrels, but the mount hit the wooden logs of the crib. He had reached maximum depression. He couldn't aim any lower. The grenadiers were entering the safe zone. They were pulling the pins on their Type 97 grenades, preparing to toss them into the nest. The lieutenant saw it too. He raised his carbine, but he couldn't get a clear shot without standing up and exposing himself to the storm. Kowalski didn't hesitate. He did something that wasn't in any manual. He took his thumbs off the triggers for a split second, grabbed the heavy rear handles of the mount, and physically lifted the back of the 200-pound gun into the air. He unseated the rear of the mount from the traverse bar, balancing the massive weapon on its pivot pintle. By lifting the back, he forced the muzzles down into the mud. He was aiming at the ground 5 feet in front of his own position. He slammed the triggers forward again. The bullets didn't fly through the air. They impacted the mud directly in front of the sandbags. The explosions of earth and rock were instant. The rounds dug a trench in the clay, spraying a geyser of wet, heavy sludge forward, but they also ricocheted. The copper jackets stripped off and the lead cores fragmented. Kowalski was creating a shotgun blast of dirt and metal right in the faces of the crawling grenadiers. The effect was gruesome and immediate. The grenadiers were hit by a wall of supersonic debris. The grenades they were holding dropped into the mud. 2 seconds later, the grenades detonated, setting off a chain reaction among the suicide squad. The ground in front of the gun heaved. The explosion rocked the sandbag crib, nearly knocking Kowalski off his feet. Smoke and body parts flew into the air. The threat was neutralized. The dead space had been cleared by turning the gun into a giant garden hose and spraying the ground itself. The gun was now screaming in protest. The oil on the receiver had cooked off long ago. Metal was grinding on metal. The action was slowing down, the rate of fire dropping from a roar to a heavy, labored chugging. Thump, thump, thump. The springs were losing their tension from the heat. The barrels were glowing a dull cherry red inside the steam clouds. The iron pig was dying. It had fired 4,000 rounds in 20 minutes. It had done the work of a platoon. But the Japanese were broken. The failure of the grenadiers and the relentless, unceasing wall of fire had shattered their morale. No army, no matter how disciplined, can walk into a meat grinder forever. The chant of Banzai had faded into the cries of the wounded. The wave began to recede. The brown shapes in the darkness turned and melted back into the jungle. They were leaving their dead and their pride on the slope of Target Hill. Kowalski didn't stop firing immediately. He couldn't be sure they were gone. He kept the hammers down, sweeping the edge of the tree line, chasing the shadows. He fired until the belts ran dry. The right gun clicked empty first. Click. Then the left, click. The sudden silence that followed was heavier than the noise. The ringing in the men's ears was a high-pitched scream that wouldn't go away. Kowalski slumped forward, resting his forehead on the hot steel of the receiver. His hands were locked into claws from gripping the handles. He couldn't uncurl his fingers. His arms were trembling uncontrollably, the lactic acid burn mixing with the adrenaline dump. He was gasping for air, inhaling the thick, acrid smoke of burnt gunpowder and boiling oil. He looked down. He was standing in a sea of brass. The empty shell casings were piled up to his knees, a glittering, golden drift that filled the bottom of the foxhole. The lieutenant stood up slowly. He looked out into the darkness. Then he looked at the smoking, steaming pile of naval junk that had just saved their lives. He looked at Kowalski, who was covered in mud, blood, and grease, looking more like a statue than a man. The officer didn't check his map. He didn't check his radio. He walked over to the gun, reached down, and picked up a single hot brass casing. He rolled it between his fingers, feeling the heat, acknowledging the weight of it. The attack was over. The ridge was held. And the weapon that the experts had laughed at, the boat anchor that was too heavy to carry and too stupid to use, was the only reason any of them were seeing the sunrise. The squad began to crawl out of their holes, moving toward the gun like pilgrims approaching a shrine. They touched the warm barrels. They looked at the empty ammo boxes. They looked at the jungle that had been chewed into sawdust. They weren't laughing anymore. They were believers. The sunrise on December 27, 1943, didn't look like a sunrise. It looked like a bruise spreading across the eastern sky. The gray light filtered down through the remaining canopy, revealing a scene that looked less like a military victory and more like a natural disaster. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a heavy, humid mist that clung to the ground. In the silence of the morning, the Marines of the squad slowly stood up in their holes. They were ghost white, their skin wrinkled from 20 hours of submersion in water, their eyes sunken deep into their skulls. They moved with the stiffness of old men, their joints locked by cold and adrenaline. They wiped the mud from their eyes and looked out over the parapet of the sandbag crib to see what the iron pig had done. What they saw stopped the breath in their throats. The jungle in front of Kowalski's position was simply gone. The dense wall of vines, ferns, and hardwood trees that had obscured their vision yesterday had been erased. For a width of 50 yards and a depth of 100 yards, the vegetation had been cut down to the height of a man's knee. It looked as if a giant, invisible lawnmower had been pushed down the hill. Trees as thick as telephone poles were sheared in half, their splintered stumps pointing accusingly at the sky. The ground was churned into a slurry of mud and wood chips, a mulch of destruction created by thousands of high-velocity rounds. But it was the human cost that told the real story. The Japanese assault force lay where they had fallen. They weren't scattered randomly. They were arranged in tragic waves. The first wave was piled up at the 80-yard mark, cut down by the initial burst. The second wave lay at the 50-yard line, and the final, desperate suicide charge lay just 10 feet from the muzzle of the guns. The bodies were stacked 3 deep in places, a testament to the terrifying discipline of the Imperial Army and the terrifying efficiency of the twin mount. They had charged into a buzzsaw, and the buzzsaw had not jammed. The official body count in that sector would later be confirmed at over 200 enemy soldiers. A single gun, manned by a stubborn sergeant and fed by a scavenged naval ammunition supply, had broken the back of a battalion-sized attack. The lieutenant walked down the line, inspecting the positions. He looked like he had aged 10 years in a single night. He walked up to Kowalski's crib. He didn't say a word. He couldn't. He looked at the gun, which was now a blackened, smoking ruin. The paint on the water jackets was completely burned off, leaving bare, discolored metal. The barrels were drooping slightly, warped by the intense heat. The gun sat in a pile of brass casings that was so deep it buried the bottom of the tripod logs. The lieutenant stepped into the hole, and his boots crunched on the empty shells. It was the sound of money. It was the sound of survival. He looked at Kowalski, who was sitting on an empty ammo crate, trying to clean the grease from his hands with a rag. The officer reached into his pocket and pulled out a pack of cigarettes. He tapped one out and handed it to the sergeant. Then he lit it. It was a small gesture, but in the Marine Corps, it was a knighthood. It was an admission that the chain of command had been wrong, and the guy with the wrench had been right. The junk that the lieutenant had ordered him to leave on the beach had just saved the entire company from being overrun. The mockery was dead. The legend of the boat gun was born right there in the smoke. In the days that followed, the twin mount became the most famous weapon on Cape Gloucester. The story spread down the line like wildfire. Marines from other companies trekked through the mud just to look at it. They wanted to see the Frankenstein gun that had deleted a Japanese charge. They ran their hands over the cooling jackets. They marveled at the sheer size of the ammo boxes. It became a totem, a good luck charm. Other squads began scouring the beach wrecks, looking for their own twin mounts, looking for anything heavy that could bolt to a log. Kowalski had started a trend. He had proven that in the jungle, firepower is king, and portability is a luxury you can't afford. But the iron pig itself was finished. The barrels were shot out, smooth as pipes on the inside. The return springs were fused. It had given its life for the ridge, but the Marines didn't leave it there. They couldn't bear to abandon it. When the division finally moved out, pushing deeper into the island to take the airfield, they dragged the broken gun with them. They welded it to the back of a half-track. They used it as a mascot. It became a symbol of the MacGyver spirit of the Pacific War, the idea that you use what you have, you fix what is broken, and you never, ever listen to an expert who tells you that something is impossible. Sergeant Kowalski survived the campaign. He survived the Green Inferno, Peleliu, and Okinawa. He went home in 1945, a quiet man with a few ribbons in his pocket and a piece of shrapnel in his cheek. He didn't become a general. He didn't run for office. He went back to work in a steel mill in Pennsylvania. He spent the rest of his life working with heavy machinery, with gears and grease and heat. He was the kind of guy who could fix your lawnmower with a paperclip, the kind of neighbor who had a garage full of useful junk that his wife wanted him to throw away, but he never did. He knew that one day that junk might be the only thing that works. He rarely spoke about the war. When people asked him what he did in the Marines, he would just say he was in supply or transport. He didn't tell them about the night on Target Hill. He didn't tell them about the feeling of the butterfly triggers vibrating against his thumbs or the sound of the steam screaming from the water jackets. That was a private memory, a dark room that he kept locked. But every time he saw a picture of a sleek, high-tech jet fighter or a computerized missile system, he would smile a grim little smile. He knew the truth about war. He knew that all the technology in the world doesn't matter when the enemy is 10 feet away and the rain is falling. He knew that in the end, it comes down to physics and grit. It comes down to a man standing in the mud, refusing to move, holding onto a piece of cold steel that everyone else said was useless. The world moved on. The military replaced the heavy water-cooled guns with lightweight plastic rifles. They replaced the grunt logic with computer models. The Twin 30 mount was melted down for scrap, turned into girders for skyscrapers or fenders for Chevys. The specific tool was lost to history. So the next time you're told that your plan is too heavy or too stupid, remember Sergeant Kowalski. Remember the wall of brass. Sometimes, the heavy burden is the only thing that keeps you from being blown away. If you respect the men who held the line when the world was burning, hit that like button. It helps us keep digging these stories out of the mud. Subscribe so you don't miss our next breakdown of forgotten hardware. And tell us in the comments, what is another piece of junk gear that turned out to be a lifesaver? We read every single one. Keep your powder dry. We'll see you in the next one. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hardware of history, if you respect the men who held the line when the world was burning, then do us a favor. Smash that like button. It helps us feed the algorithm and find more stories like this. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next breakdown of the forgotten weapons of World War II. And tell us in the comments, what is another piece of junk gear that turned out to be a lifesaver? We read every single comment. Thank you for watching. Keep your powder dry, and we will see you in the next one.